Today you will hear a testimony that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, pride, and redemption. His name is Yusuf Al-Rahman, a former Imam from Amman, Jordan, respected and feared within the Islamic community in Michigan. For decades, he preached against Christianity, until something unexpected happened. His own son, Omar, a theology student, stepped onto the stage of an American university to debate Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA. That debate began as an exchange of ideas, but ended as a spiritual collision no one saw coming. Within a few hours, the faith and life of an entire family would be put to the test. Get ready. What Yusuf saw and heard after that night will give you chills. And before we begin, make sure you are subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you.
I remember exactly how it all began. Before any sign of change, before the sound of sirens and tears, my life had followed the same pattern for decades. I would wake up before sunrise, walk through the still empty streets of Dearborn, Michigan, with the Quran under my arm and my head held high, as if I carried the certainty of a man who could never be wrong. People greeted me with respect, and I responded with that same reserved smile, the smile of someone who feels he owns the truth. In the mosque, every eye turned toward me. I was Imam Yusuf Al-Rahman, the man who spoke with conviction, who knew the sacred texts by heart, who scolded the young men when they showed too much curiosity about the Western world. But what no one saw was the silence that followed me home. A silence that did not come from peace, but from absence. My wife, the only woman who ever understood the weight of my faith, had died in an attack in the Middle East, and although everyone said it was God's will, something dark grew inside me, a resentment I hid behind prayer and discipline. I preached that suffering purifies, but the truth was that my suffering only hardened me. 4 years, I taught that Christianity was the root of the West's weakness. I told my students that the cross represented the corruption of true faith. The audience applauded me. I felt powerful. But at night, when the mosque emptied, and the echo of my words still vibrated on the walls, something inside me whispered that maybe I was just repeating old phrases to hide my fear of facing pain. At home, the only one who dared challenge that silence was my son, Omar. He was different. He had curiosity, a spark in his eyes, and a restless mind that made me uneasy. He studied comparative theology at the University of Michigan, and sometimes came home with books I didn't even want to touch, the Bible, writings by C.S. Lewis, excerpts from modern Christian debates. I would get irritated easily. I told him he was contaminating himself, that he was opening doors to unnecessary doubts. And yet, deep down, something in me admired his courage. At dinner, the discussions were inevitable. Omar asked questions I pretended not to hear. Father, what if love is stronger than law? What if God doesn't want obedience out of fear, but surrender out of love? Those words disturbed me. I heard in them a dangerous echo, the same echo I once tried to silence within myself, but nothing prepared me for the day he received the invitation to take part in a public debate. An event streamed online with hundreds of students, professors, and onlookers. The theme, Christianity versus Islam in the 21st century. The moderator would be Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA. When he told me, I felt the blood freeze in my veins. I knew who Charlie was, a bold, devoted Christian who spoke about faith with the same intensity with which I defended mine. I forbade Omar from participating. I told him it was a trap, that he was exposing himself to ridicule, but he didn't listen. And deep down, I think I knew he wouldn't. He always wanted to understand the other side. He wanted answers, and maybe he wanted to prove to me that faith without love is only fear in disguise. That afternoon is engraved in my memory. I saw it through the computer screen, a packed auditorium. Omar, holding the microphone, looked calm. When Charlie Kirk began speaking about grace, about a God who loves without demanding anything in return, I shook my head in disdain. But then my son replied, and his words didn't sound like an attack, but like a search. He quoted Matthew chapter 5 verse 44, "Love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you." And he added, "Maybe true power lies in forgiving, not in punishing." I froze. For a moment, I forgot I was his father and listened as if he were any other debater. But the audience reacted, applause, astonished looks. Charlie smiled, and in that exchange of glances between them, something happened. It wasn't about intellectual victory. It was something deeper, something I couldn't name. Hours later, the video was already circulating online. Imam's son debates Charlie Kirk and quotes the New Testament. The headlines were provocative. My phone wouldn't stop ringing. Messages, veiled threats, hateful comments. Within days, I was called to an emergency meeting at the mosque. The words still echo, "Yusuf, you have lost control of your house." And the man who loses his house loses his honor. The suspension came like a sword strike. I walked out feeling a weight that the Michigan wind could not lift. When I returned home, Omar was waiting. I tried to speak, but the words turned into shouting. I accused him of destroying our family's name, of betraying the faith, of dishonoring his mother's memory. He stayed silent. His tearful eyes showed no anger, only compassion. And that enraged me even more. He left without saying where he was going. The door slammed, and the sound echoed down the hall like a warning. Through the night, I tried to pray, but found no words. Pride, for the first time, gave me no strength. At dawn, the phone rang. It was an unknown number. I answered, and the police officer's voice sounded distant, muffled, as if coming from underwater. "Mr. Al-Rahman, your son has been in an accident." The world stopped. The following words came in fragments: wrecked car, rural road, critical condition. I fell to my knees. I don't know how long I stayed there. I only remember saying something I never thought would leave my lips: "God, whoever you are, please hear me." That night felt endless. I sat in the empty mosque, the lights off, the cold, damp air seeping through the windows. For the first time in decades, no one was listening, only the sound of my own remorse. I thought of every sermon, every word of contempt I had thrown at Christians, every time I had closed my ears to love. It was in that absolute silence that I heard something different, a whisper. It sounded like wind sweeping across the desert. And then the light came, a light so intense it didn't come from any lamp, from any reflection. I stood up startled, trying to understand what was happening. In the midst of this brightness, a figure took shape, not in a threatening way, but with a serenity that completely disarmed me. The face was impossible to describe. There was something in the eyes, a mixture of power and compassion, and that's when I heard, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. He who believes in me will never be lost." The voice didn't come from outside. It came from within. It was as if each word vibrated inside my chest, piercing layers of resistance I didn't even know still existed. I tried to cover my face, but the tears prevented me. The pride that had always been my shield crumbled. The light disappeared. I stood there, frozen, trying to understand if I had gone mad. I ran out of the mosque, feeling my heart pounding erratically. The air seemed lighter, but also more real. For the first time in a long time, I felt something I had never found in religion: peace. The next morning, the phone rang again. I was afraid to answer. But on the other end of the line, the doctor's voice sounded like a miracle. "Mr. Al-Rahman, your son is alive." I didn't believe it. I asked if they were sure. He said it was inexplicable. Omar had survived, even after they had declared there was no chance. When I arrived at the hospital, the room was plunged into silence. The machine made rhythmic sounds, and Omar's face seemed peaceful. He slowly opened his eyes and, upon seeing me, smiled. I fell to my knees, overcome by something I can't describe. And then he whispered, "Dad." Jesus was with me in the car. He held my hand. I trembled. The same name, the same presence, the same brilliance. It was impossible. How could two men, one in a mask, the other inside a burning car, have seen the same thing? In that instant, I understood that nothing I had experienced up to that point had been a coincidence. What happened that night was supernatural. It was the answer to my most desperate prayer. God, whoever you are, hear me. And He listened to me. After the miracle, I thought everything would get easier. I thought that, finally, the peace I felt that night would remain. But the truth is that true faith begins precisely when everything falls apart. At first, it seemed like a dream. People came to me to ask what had happened. They wanted to know if it was true that I, the former Imam of Dearborn, had seen Jesus. I spoke carefully, humbly, without quite understanding how to explain the inexplicable. But news spreads fast, and the same voice that had applauded me before now called me a traitor. The community leaders called me to a meeting. I entered that room, knowing what awaited me. Their gaze was heavy, as if I had committed a crime. "Yusuf," they said, "you are dishonoring the faith. You have become an apostate." That word sounded like a verdict. One of them pointed a finger at me and said that I had contaminated my own son with Western ideas, and that the fate of those who abandon the truth is shame. I left there in silence. The same corridor where I had walked with respect 4 years now seemed like enemy territory. The next day, I found an anonymous letter taped to my door. There was no signature, just one sentence: "Turn back, or you will pay the price." At that moment, I realized that my decision wouldn't just be spiritual, it would be a real fight for survival. Omar and I began to live discreetly. We changed addresses, slept at friends' houses, and sometimes in rooms borrowed from a small local Christian group that had heard our story. They were simple people, but with a kindness I had never known. When they prayed, I felt something different. It wasn't obligation, it was love. Even so, there was a war raging inside me. I wondered how I could serve a God I had denied all my life. Every time I opened the Bible, the weight of guilt fell on my shoulders, especially when I read John chapter 3, "For God so loved the world." These words, which I had so often despised, now broke me inside. I read them and wept, not from remorse, but from true regret, the kind that comes when you realize how much you hurt love without ever understanding what it was. I spent many sleepless nights, mentally reviewing the sermons I preached for decades. I remembered the times I taught fear as if it were obedience, and how I used religion as a shield against my own pain. It was unbearable. Some nights I would kneel and ask God to teach me everything again, as if I were a child. Sometimes the pain was so intense that I would simply repeat, "Lord, I don't know how to pray, but you know what's inside me." Weeks turned into months. Gradually, I realized that the community's rejection was less painful than the internal confrontation with the man I had been. And it was during this time of solitude that something beautiful began to blossom. Omar and I spent hours studying together, comparing the Quran and the Bible, finding points of light that I had never seen before. His heart seemed free, and mine, though still wounded, began to beat with hope. We grew closer than ever before. It was as if God was restoring not only our faith, but also the bond that pride had destroyed. But when the light begins to shine, the darkness always tries to extinguish it, and the blow came when I least expected it. Everything seemed to be calming down until I received an invitation to participate in an interfaith event in Detroit. They said it would be an opportunity to promote dialogue and tolerance. I hesitated, but felt I should go. I thought perhaps it was time to show that love is stronger than fear. The auditorium was full. Representatives of various faiths took turns on stage, speaking about coexistence and respect. When it was my turn, I briefly recounted my journey without attacking anyone, just sharing what I had experienced, the encounter that changed my life. People listened in silence, but in the middle of the audience, I recognized a face. It was Hassan, a former disciple of mine. Someone who, 4 years, repeated my words, studied under my guidance, and called me his mentor. His gaze was filled with something I knew well, anger. He stood up abruptly and shouted. His voice echoed in the hall. "You betrayed the faith. You have shamed us all. You said you believed in the truth, and now you worship the God of the unbelievers." The audience was shocked. I tried to respond calmly, but he continued, "You don't deserve forgiveness. You will be an example of what happens to those who abandon the path." Security guards removed him from the premises, but his words stayed with me. I knew what it meant. In the following days, I realized I was being followed. The windows of the small Christian center, where we met, were broken. We received threatening messages. Even so, I continued. I felt I couldn't turn back. It was as if every fear became a test to see if my faith was real or just emotion. And then came the night of the fire. It was Friday. We had just finished a prayer meeting, and some young people were still in the hall, talking and singing. I was the last to leave. I was locking the door when I smelled something, a mixture of gasoline and smoke. Within seconds, flames began to spread through the curtains. Someone had thrown Molotov cocktails through the side windows. The fire spread quickly. I heard screams inside. I ran back, trying to open the door, which was already on fire. The heat was unbearable, the air heavy. I managed to crawl inside. I saw 3 boys trapped near the stage, coughing, unable to get out because of the smoke. I yelled for them to get down and crawl towards the exit. One of them fainted. I caught him in my arms. I remember the feeling of his body, light, almost lifeless. I carried the first one out, went back and brought the second, then the third. Each time I returned, the fire seemed more intense, as if it wanted to swallow me whole. When I finally got out, I couldn't breathe properly anymore. Everything was spinning. I fell to my knees, watching the flames engulf the building that had once been a symbol of rebirth. The sound of sirens grew closer, and someone pulled me away. The pain in my lungs was like burning iron, and yet I felt peace. Not because the fire was over, but because, somehow, I knew my life was in the right hands. In the hospital, the air was too cold, machines beeped, and the smoke still burned inside me. Omar was by my side, trying to hold back tears. I could barely speak, but I managed to pray. Softly, with a hoarse voice, I whispered, "Lord, if my sacrifice is necessary so that others may find you, so be it." I didn't know if I would survive, but something inside me told me that this moment wouldn't be the end. When I woke up, the room was silent. The soft light shone on Omar's face. He held my hand and smiled. "Dad, there's something you need to know." I looked at him, confused. He told me that one of the boys I rescued from the fire, a young man named Michael, who was the son of an old friend of mine, had sought out the group's pastor that morning. Michael said that when he saw me enter the flames without hesitation, something broke inside him. He realized he had never understood what the love of Christ meant until he saw a man give his own life for others. And that same day, he asked to be baptized. Tears streamed down my face. It wasn't pride. It was gratitude. God had even used pain to transform the impossible into a testimony. I remembered the words I heard in the mosque that distant night. "He who believes in me will never be lost." And now I understood what it meant. No matter how much the fire tries to consume, what is born of God is never destroyed. The newspapers reported the fire, but few told the truth. Some said it was an accident. Others insinuated vandalism. But for me, that fire wasn't destruction, it was purification. The ashes of what we lost became the soil where faith flourished. People who had previously doubted began to seek us out. Some wanted to understand what kept us standing even after so much. Others simply came in silence, sat beside me, and said, "I want to know this Jesus who gave you courage." While I was recovering, I realized something I had never understood when I was an imam. True faith is not measured by the number of followers, but by the willingness to love when the whole world hates you. I no longer had the mask, nor public respect, nor titles, but for the first time I had something that no position had given me: the real presence of God within me. There were still wounds, both physical and emotional. Sometimes I would wake up at night with the sound of fire in my ears, the same sound that once represented fear, now reminding me of rebirth. Because it was there, in the midst of chaos, that I learned that the light doesn't go out even when everything around is smoke. And that's why I keep telling my story. Because every person who listens understands that God isn't just in cathedrals, or masks, or theories. He's in the heart that chooses to love when it would be easier to hate. And if the price of faith is fire, then let it burn away everything that isn't true. I never imagined I would ever step onto a stage again. For a long time, I thought my voice had been silenced forever, that the fire had taken not only my breath, but also any chance of a new beginning. But when I woke up in the hospital and learned that young Michael had given his life to God, after seeing me risk mine, something inside me awakened. It was as if the Spirit itself was telling me, "Yusuf, now the real ministry begins." And it was there, with my hands still marked by the flames, that I understood I hadn't just been saved from death, I had been saved for a mission. The first few months were difficult. My body was weak, my breath was short, and my mind still carried the trauma of the fire. But with each visit I received, with each hug from people who said they had been touched by my story, my faith gained new strength. A local pastor told me something I'll never forget. God doesn't waste pain. Yusuf, He transforms ashes into testimonies. Those words resonated within me, and, little by little, I realized that what I had lived through wasn't a burden, it was a calling. When I left the hospital, the first place I visited was the site of the old Christian center. All that remained was the smell of smoke and pieces of twisted wood. I knelt there and prayed, asking for nothing, only giving thanks. Omar put his hand on my shoulder and said, "Dad, the fire destroyed the walls, but it didn't destroy the faith. Let's rebuild." At that moment, I realized that the son I once questioned was now the man who strengthened me. That's how the project was born. Light in the desert. The name came from an image I saw for a dream. A small flame shining amidst the dark sand. It seemed fragile, but it wouldn't go out, even in the wind. Our faith was like that too, tested, but alive. The project started small, with weekly meetings in a borrowed room at a Baptist church. There were few participants: curious Muslims, Christians afraid to talk, skeptical atheists who came only to see the ex-imam. I spoke simply, without complex theology, just recounting what had happened to me. And every time I said, Jesus met me in the midst of my unbelief, the silence in the room became dense, as if the entire air stopped to listen. Soon, the stories began to multiply. A Syrian man approached me after a lecture. Crying, he said he had lived tormented by years of guilt and hatred, and that, upon hearing my story, he felt for the first time the desire to pray again. A Palestinian woman, married to an American, recounted how she hid her curiosity about the Bible for fear of being rejected by her family, and that, upon hearing the name Light in the Desert, she felt the courage to seek the truth. They were wounded, confused people, but thirsty for faith, and it was there that I understood that God was calling me to something I never would have imagined, to be a point of light for those living on the border between fear and faith. In the early years, we traveled to dozens of cities, universities, community centers, interfaith conferences, sometimes small rural churches with 30 people, other times packed auditoriums with hundreds. I was still surprised by the audience's reaction. Some came simply out of curiosity. They wanted to see the converted ex-imam. But when I started speaking, curiosity turned to silence. I wasn't trying to convince anyone. I was simply telling the truth. And, somehow, the truth spoke for itself. I remember one particular night in Dallas. The auditorium was packed. Among the audience was a group of Muslim students who, clearly, weren't there to applaud me. I began to speak about my life before my encounter with God, about pride, hatred, and emptiness. And then I quoted John 3:16, as I always do. For God so loved the world, that he gave his one and only Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish, but have eternal life. Those words still break me every time I say them. I said them with tears in my eyes, and I noticed that one of the students, a young woman in a blue hijab, began to cry. In the end, she approached me and said, I had never heard anyone speak of God with so much love. She didn't convert there, and that wasn't my goal. But a seed was planted, and that's what faith does. It plants the invisible and lets God make it grow. Omar became my right-hand man. Together, we recorded lectures, organized debates, and wrote short guides to help people who wanted to understand Christianity without fear, without the pressure of choosing a side. Our motto was simple: seeking the truth is never betrayal. Churches began inviting us to conferences, radio stations requested interviews, and even universities became interested in our interfaith dialogue program. But, more than the exposure, what moved me were the letters. Hundreds of people wrote saying that, upon hearing our story, they had found the courage to start over. One day, we received a message from a prison in Florida. A Muslim inmate said he had heard my testimony on a community radio station and, for the first time in years, had slept peacefully. He wrote, "If God has forgiven you, perhaps there is still hope for me." That letter has remained in my Bible ever since. It was there that I realized the gospel isn't an argument, it's an embrace. I no longer use titles. People still call me pastor, brother, or sometimes even professor, but I prefer to simply say, I am a man who has been forgiven. There is no pulpit, no office, no position that compares to the freedom of simply walking and telling what God has done. And yet, paradoxically, I perceive a new authority in my voice, not the authority of power, but that of one who has been broken and rebuilt by the Creator's own hands. There are days when I still find myself thinking about everything I've lost: friends, prestige, old certainties. But then I remember that it was by losing everything that I found what truly mattered. Sometimes I look at Omar and think about how much God used that debate, that tragedy, that fire, to bring us to this point. If someone had told me years ago that I would travel across the United States to speak about the love of Jesus, I would have laughed. Today, I laugh too, but with gratitude. On one of our trips, we were invited to speak at an interfaith conference in New York. It was symbolic. The same city where I had once criticized the Christian faith now welcomed me to hear about transformation. I slowly walked onto the stage, my hands still marked, holding a worn Bible. I began by saying, years ago, I preached that God was distant and harsh. Today, I know that He is near and merciful. And then I spoke about the fire, about Michael, about each person I saw touched. In the end, the audience rose in silence, not in applause, but in reverence. It was one of the most powerful moments of my life. Since then, I've never stopped. Every city, every face, every hug is a reminder that grace doesn't choose resumes, nationalities, or pasts. And the more I speak, the more I realize that my testimony isn't just mine, it belongs to everyone who once felt too far away to be reached. I still get emotional every time I read John 3:16. Those words are the bridge between the man I was and the man I am now. They remind me that faith isn't about what we've done, but about what He has done. And perhaps that's why, when I finish my talks, I often look at the audience and say, it doesn't matter where you are. God still writes stories of new beginnings. Today, when I look back, I see that the desert of my life was never a punishment. It was the perfect setting for the light to shine. The project light in the desert, it continues to grow. We have already helped hundreds of people find answers, comfort, and faith. Some have become missionaries, others remain silent, living the transformation in secret. Each story is a flame that ignites in another heart. And every time someone asks me how it's possible to go on after so much pain, I smile and say, because now I know the truth, and the truth has set me free. There is no deeper explanation than that. The man who once raised his voice to condemn now speaks to heal. The same one who was once lost in the shadows now walks in the light. But even though my life has changed, I know the journey is far from over. There are more paths, more encounters, more souls waiting for that same hope. And that's why I continue, not because I want to tell a story, but because my story is still being written.
Today you will hear a testimony that will challenge everything you think you know about faith, pride, and redemption. His name is Yusuf Al-Rahman, a former Imam from Amman, Jordan, respected and feared within the Islamic community in Michigan. For decades, he preached against Christianity, until something unexpected happened. His own son, Omar, a theology student, stepped onto the stage of an American university to debate Charlie Kirk, the founder of Turning Point USA. That debate began as an exchange of ideas, but ended as a spiritual collision no one saw coming. Within a few hours, the faith and life of an entire family would be put to the test. Get ready. What Yusuf saw and heard after that night will give you chills. And before we begin, make sure you are subscribed, like the video, and tell me where you are watching from, because this story is going to move you.